everybody. Thank you very much for joining us here today. Paul Taubman with 9.Connects. You are in the right place if you are here for our webinar on human instruction for PCB manufacturing. So I do have two objectives for today. First and foremost, to provide an overview of the Draftsman Tool in Altium Designer. And of course, we did extend this invitation to those people who are not using Draftsman, because we do provide a tool here at 9.Connects called PCB Blueprint from Downstream Technologies. We are a VAR for them. And so if you like what you see here today, I'll talk a little bit more about Blueprint afterwards. The second thing is to show how the tool can make human readable documentation a lot easier. So it's not just a matter of just showing a tool, it's also just kind of saying, let's take a look at this human instruction element of the manufacturing for PCB design as well. Last thing I wanted to mention for housekeeping purposes before we continue to move on, if you do have questions, please do write them down in the questions panel. I think we might have some time for those today, depending on how things go. So let's begin here with documentation. So what's its purpose anyways? If we really boil down all the documentation that we've got to provide, and there's quite a bit of documentation we do have to provide to the manufacturers, it's either to instruct a human or to program a machine. That's what it really boils down to. And to program a machine, that's not really a major issue, because there's formats out there that the EDA tools can follow, so that when you tell it to produce it for that format, well, voila, it's there. But when it comes to instructing humans, we actually seem to have there seems to be issues with that. And let's take a look at that. So when you look at, and by the way, I put these up here for just kind of a context as to how much of this stuff is actually human versus how much of this is actually equipment related. And when you look at fabrication, a little less than 50% of it is human instruction, but nevertheless, almost half of it is indeed human instruction, things that you've got to provide to somebody in order for them to do the work that you want them to do. The rest of it is equipment. And if you look at assembly, about 50% of it is also human instruction as well. The rest of it is just basically equipment information. So what's interesting about human instruction files is that, how do we provide them? Well, we do it in a whole bunch of different ways. We do them in Word docs, PDFs, Excel sheets, emails, and of course, phone calls. And when you look at phone calls and emails, these are probably the ones that we use the most in order to communicate with the fabricator or the contract manufacturer. The problem with both of these is pretty substantial. First and foremost, the phone calls, we don't record them. It's interesting that all of this other information is recordable, but we don't record phone calls, or at least it's illegal in many cases, and it's kind of creepy anyways. So we don't record them, so we're doing things based off of basically trust, word of mouth and trust. And that's obviously, most of that's going to get lost because it was just heard between human ears, especially if it was never written down. The second area is that we spend a lot of time in emails. And the biggest problem I find with emails is that they're very personal. So even though, when I say personal, that means that, yes, you're in a company, yes, you represent that company, but let's say you move on from one company to another. Nobody really remembers who actually worked on that project years later. And more importantly, they wouldn't, even if they knew who worked on it, they're not even sure what to search for within your emails to make sure that they could find the information that they need. So emails are more of a personal archive than they really are of a business archive, even though they are a business mechanism. And of course, these other ones over here are fine and dandy if indeed they're put in a place that somebody knows where they are. And of course, if you do, let's say you do some notes in Excel, you do another one in PDF, you do another one in Word, you have to hope that they're all in the same location. And of course, a lot of us have this tendency to put things on a hard drive, personal hard drive, and some of that ends up in a shared drive, and some of them may have ended up in your user shared drive, and so they get a little bit scattered. So what are we really missing over here? First and foremost, a central document just to capture it all. And secondly, a reusable document, something that once we've set this up, we can use it again and again and again. And that is what Draftsman is trying to provide here. So what is the strategy? The strategy is to make use of the features that are connected to your .pcb. So for those who are not Altium users, the PCB doc is basically your layout documentation. If you're looking at another tool such as like Blueprint, for example, Blueprint would actually use the manufacturing files, whereas in Altium Designer, they would use directly the layout information. So what do they have over here? We have things like board assembly views. That's what you're seeing over here. It's an example of it, and so on and so forth. I'll show more of this as we go along here today. The key thing I want you to recognize is that by me simply pulling this from the menu, it instantly will look like this. So I don't have to make this thing look like this, other than the fact that I had to put some 3D parts onto my components. But there it is, okay? Just by me saying, hey, put down the board fabrication view, I get it instantly, and then from there I can change scales and do a few other things which I'll show you throughout this webinar. So in the end, what I've got is I've got things that are linked to the board, and I can update this information. So it's not static information where, and that's one of the biggest problems we have with documentation. We put this documentation together, we make a change, and we forget where we have to make those changes. Here we can make the change, and then we can tell it to update. It updates it very much like a library. So it works out very nicely in that way. That's all I wanted to show you for PowerPoint slides. Obviously, you want to take a look at the tool here. So I'm going to escape out of this here, and let's take a look at the tool. So I've got Altium Designer 18 up. We've got Draftsman up here. The first thing I wanted to show you were basically the non-electrical things. So what you see over here on the screen are the non-electrical. So you've got the lines and the circles and the arcs and the rectangles. And, you know, the funny part is that the more and more I think about it, again, if you kind of boil things down to their basics, what are we doing with an editor? Well, with an editor, we're basically having editor itself along with a bunch of primitives that we place down, and that's what our primitives are over here as such. Okay. I was just reminded also, before I continue on with this, we do actually have a polling question. I'm kind of curious to know this now that I've kind of shown these, shown the PowerPoint slides to you. So I'd like to put that polling question up at this point in time. Okay. So I'm just kind of curious if you guys are even using the Draftsman tool or if you're using other methods to do your documentation. So if you can take a moment to take a look at that. All right, so we're going to show those over here. And so it looks like most of you, or a good portion of you, are still using it. It's not over 50%, which is a little bit surprising to me. I thought more people might have still been using like the traditional things we just talked about. A lot of you are actually using MCAD tools to provide this documentation. And actually a good portion of you, about 1/3 of you, are also using the Draftsman already. So hopefully I'll show you a few things that you don't already know about. And then there are a small percentage of you who are using Blueprint. Hopefully you find this, hopefully you still find this useful, because even if you're using Blueprint, a lot of the concepts are still very applicable over here. So thank you very much for taking that poll here. So let me jump back over here. So what I'm showing you over here are the non-electrical things that are provided in the editor. So you can see about 1/3 of these things are the non-electrical. What you're going to find in this editor over here is that even though they categorize them as lines and circles and so on and so forth, they really kind of stick to the same properties. So for example, you can see that there are 6 different types of what we'll call line types: solid, dash, phantom, et cetera, over here. And then there's also 7 different types of thicknesses. So it's not like you can change the thickness by changing some type of font number or some type of number of inches or mils here. They really predefine that for you. But the same is true in the circles and of course in the arcs here. I'll talk about the arcs here in a minute, because there's probably a little note I should make for those who are just using any editor within Altium. But when it comes to the circles over here, they've added these features called ANSI 31 and ANSI 37. So if you like to have these candy stripes or you want to have the crisscross hash marks, you can do that as well. And they give you some flexibility to that. So if you want 2 different colors, you can. And you can also change the thickness in which these things are being done. So if I change this to 0.4, for example, I can change which lines have a thicker or thinner representation to them so as well. So they do provide this for the circles and the regions and for the squares, which you'll see here for just a moment. When it comes to the arcs, they do list 2 different types of arcs here. So there's arcs for bi-center and by 3-point. What's interesting about it is, at the end of the day, no matter which one of these 2 you use in the menu, it's still an arc primitive. It's just giving you 2 different ways of drawing the arc out. So just be aware of that for the arcs. Here are the rectangles, which obviously can be made into looking like rectangles, and there's also regions as well, which are just basically multi-side. They're basically polygons. They can be more than one-sided. The only thing I want to show here is that if you're familiar with drawing lines or circles or even polygons in the schematics, you can see here that you can do 90, curve 45, curve 45. So the shift space bar, which you've used in the other editors, is still very, very applicable over here as well. So you can use that. You also notice these are the callouts. I'll talk a little bit more about callouts when we get to looking at the actual documentation here. What I just want to do is kind of give you just a general overview of how they set up Draftsman here. The other thing you may have noticed is that I've been going from page to page, and that's a little bit different than what we've seen in the schematic editor and the PCB editor. For schematics, if you needed another page, you would have to create another file. That's not the case with Draftsman. It's just simply a matter of going to Tools, and then you add a sheet in there, and there it goes. Wanted to make one comment about the text. So one of the things they're trying to prevent you from doing is using text boxes. And probably, in one sense, it's good because there's a lot of really great features in the place menu over here that probably do a better job when it comes to text. So if it comes to just putting down a text box here, they do give you a lot of features to set it up. So you can see the different things that you can do with the text in terms of color and position, fill, or using the ANSI hash marks there. But when it comes to actually changing the text here, you've got to do it in the properties. So if I click on this over here where it says the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, if I want to change this to have it to say it properly, because it's actually supposed to be jumps, not jumped, then I've got to actually go into the properties panel here and make that change. So I've got to make that change here, and then once I'm done, it's now been changed. So that's just probably the only, I'd say, difficulty of the text itself, but I think there was a reason for them doing that, and that was again so that you'd use the real features once we get into the fabrication notes and the assembly notes. We can also put images in there as well. As I said, we can add sheets in. So if I want to, I can delete this sheet. So if I just go in here to tools and I say remove sheet, it's going to remove it. If I want to add it, I add it in. When I do add in another sheet, it takes the template that I had for the last sheet. So if I go to tools and I say add sheet, it will do so, but it will pick up the template. I want to talk a minute about the template because there's a couple of caveats here. I'll give you some good news and I'll give you some bad news. So the good news I'll start off with. If you're creating a template, you can. So there's actually two different types of templates in Draftsman. There is the template for the sheet itself, and then the Draftsman itself can actually become a template. And I'll show that at the very end, what we can do with the fabrication notes once we've actually created them. So the sheet template itself looks a lot like the one that we would have in a schematic. And as a matter of fact, what they do is that all of the parameters that you have in the schematic or on the project, so there's project level parameters that you can have, then there's definitely document parameters from the schematic that you can have, and all of those are listed over here. And so if you do create this, you can pull those parameters again. You don't have to put them back in again. That's the good news. And as a matter of fact, what I did was they fashioned this one against the schematic document that we created here. So here's our schematic template, and I'm going to split screen this. So for those people who just haven't seen split screening before or not familiar with it, I'm going to go to the document bar. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to go to split horizontal. So I'm going to split this one, and then I'll zoom this one out so you can see and compare these two together. The only major difference between these two over here is that the schematic one was actually created in a smaller sheet. It was actually 9.5 by 7. I think we must have taken a default one and ran with it, whereas the document that we created for Draftsman, or the template we created for Draftsman, is a true 11 by 8.5 by 11. So that's why you see this being a little bit elongated. But you can see all the data is pretty much the exact same because it's pulling it from the same pool of information. So that's the good news. What's the bad news? Unfortunately, I cannot copy anything from the schematic editor into the Draftsman. So if I wanted to copy these fiducials, and I do a Control-C here to copy it and I give it a point of reference, if I go over here now into the Draftsman tool and I try to place it, I cannot place it. So as a matter of fact, this template, I had to redraw it again, even though we already had it in the schematic. So that's probably one of the, I'd say probably one of the biggest things that Altium needs to address. And by the way, if you're an Altium user and you can get into the feature requests and the bug crunch, there is a pretty decent vote going on to get this remedied. So I'd ask you to do so, especially if you're using Draftsman. All right, so enough of the non-electrical stuff. Let's get to the good things. By the way, as a side note, I'm going to merge these screens together. So in the document bar, I'm going to click on the SHDOC. I'm going to do a merge all, and that will bring us back to one screen here, and I will click on our offerings here. So there it is. So hopefully it gives you a general idea of what you can do from a non-electrical point of view, and it gives you an idea of how this editor is set up. Now, let's get to the good stuff over here, fabrication notes and assembly notes. So I do have a set here, but what I'd like to do is I'm going to just use this and put it on my other screen so I can kind of use it as a guide. And there's a few things I'll show in terms of copy and paste as well. But what I would like to do is go through an example of some fabrication notes and what features they've got here, and we'll place those down. And then I'll do the same thing for the assembly notes as well here. So I'm going to just push this over here. How do we start a new design? Pretty simple. We go into a new Draftsman design. We're going to do a File, New, and we're going to go into the Draftsman document here. So let's bring this up. So you'll notice there's a bunch of templates. So a couple of these are ones that come from Altium. The assembly notes and the fabrication notes are ones that I've created. And again, I'll show you the fabrication note one here at the end on another board just to show how it works. But right now I'm going to do default because I want to start with a blank board. I'm going to press OK. So it now comes up over here. Here's my sheet. If I click on the sheet here, I have some page options. I am going to bring my template in. So bringing a template is pretty simple. I can just click on template. Altium does provide quite a few different templates already. I did create my own here, so I'm going to bring it in, and you can see that it's now in here. All right, so now I have my fabrication. What do I want to bring in? Well, the first thing that I want to bring in are my fabrication notes. And I can do this in two ways. So I'm going to show you both ways. The first one I'm going to do is I'm going to do it through an Excel, because a lot of times people do use Excel to kind of queue up their notes, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's certainly an advantage to this, because if you have a huge list of notes and you say, well, I'll cherry pick the ones I want and I'll modify them and then I'll copy them in, that works out rather nicely. And to be honest with you, if you do put them into the mechanical notes, there are some limitations there depending on which version of Altium you're using. I know that there's an OLE link that sometimes works and to me sometimes doesn't. But this, if you're going to use the Draftsman tool, I think has a big advantage for you being able to create these notes. And what's nice is that you'll be able to modify these notes once we paste them in. So this is the first thing we're going to work on here. I've got my fabrication notes here, and I am going to select them. So let me scroll down here. So I've got these notes here. And so I've got this selected. I'll do a Control-C, and I'm going to just minimize this here for a moment. I can't do a direct paste in here. I do have to use place, and I need to use the table. So I'm going to create this table. It does help to create the right numbers of rows and columns. You got to remember this isn't Excel. It's very rudimentary. So if you're having to do, you will already have to do some cleanup, but having the right number of rows and columns certainly helps. So this one has 18 rows, including the title, and it has 2 columns in it. I'm going to press OK. Okay, so it just brings this in. And if I want, I can basically put this in here, just do a Control-V to paste it in. And now I got to do a little bit of cleanup to it. So one of the things I cannot do is I can't just drag sides here. I do have to kind of select a portion of, let's say, a couple of these columns here, and I can make some changes to them. So when I do this, it will change all of them because it won't allow for unusual and odd-looking tables here. So if you select a representation of a number of rows or a number of columns, and you do a change here, it will pretty much do it to all of them there. For the fabrication notes, what I want to do with these columns here is I want 100, and that should give me a little more space. So as you can see, it's kind of coming together here. If I want to move this, I do have to click on the little label here. These things over here, when I say these instructions here are a large font. I want to drop that down a little bit. So again, I go over to my properties, and I'll drop it down to 12. So as I'm going along, I am cleaning this up. I can do specific work in individual cells. So for example, if I said in this control pedance here, so here I am, I'll zoom it in so you can see it a little bit. And I say, well, no, actually I do have a controlled pedance. I want to type yes. I can do that. So unlike text boxes, I can make changes in the table, which is a really nice feature. If I want to center things, I can do that as well. So go over here and center this. And if I don't like the color, or I don't mind the color for the basically the row and the column headers, but I do want to have this to be a different color, I can certainly do that. So let's say I want to change this over to a very light blue. I can do that here as well. So I've got a lot of control over it, but you can see it does require a bit of manipulation to get it in there. But once it's in there, it's in there. And if you do need to add like another row or another column, it's just a matter of going to the pop-up, right-clicking here, going to table, and inserting either the columns or rows, or deleting the columns and rows. But again, if you can set it up right to begin with, it probably will make your life a little bit easier, but you can do it, okay? So that's one way we can bring in some fabrication notes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you another way of doing that. So I'm going to go into Tools, and I'm going to add sheets, okay? And now that once you've got that sheet in here, here it is. I am also going to turn off the template over here, and you'll see why here in a moment. So I'm going to click on Standard, and now I've got a clean sheet. Actually, it's kind of a large one, so just give me an ANSI A. There we go. So we've got actually, well, let's do ANSI B. You'll see why here in just a moment. So here's an ANSI B. And the reason I want to do an ANSI B is because if you have really good mechanical notes, you can basically bring those notes in, and you can overlay on top of each other. So the ones we created here for the rangefinder are pretty good. You'll see a few things we'll probably have to modify, but nevertheless, here are our notes. If I hit Shift-S to go into single layer mode, you can see that I've got my notes here, and I've also got my border template, and I've got other notes as well. So I can actually bring these in, and I'll show you how to do that here. Of course, there may be some overlay, when we do that, but nevertheless, it works really, really well. And things that you can modify and think about as you perfect your mechanical notes here. So let's go back into this here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a feature and zoom this in. There we go. And I'm going to place, this time I'm going to do board fabrication view. So anytime I do a board fabrication view, by default, it will always show me the top layer in a scale of 1 to 1. Okay? And that's fine. So I do have this over here. But what I'm going to do with this one instead is, now that I've had this here, I can actually change this to any layer on my board. So if I click onto the properties here, I can see all of my layers. And if I did a good job with my mechanical layers, I can tell right away what I can bring in. So I'm going to bring in M01, which is my border template for my top side here. So I'm going to bring it in over here. And it fits in pretty well. So if I want to scale this down a little bit to make it fit a little better, I can certainly do that. Let's click on this over here. Go back to General. No, pardon me. I need to click on this because we're not on the page. Here we go. We are back in our, we're back into this fabrication board view. I'm going to change its custom scale. I tend to like to use this better because I think in percentages. So I'm going to change this down to 90%. Okay, and so we've got that here. And of course, if I really want to make it fit really tight, I could play with that. But for demonstration purposes, you can see I can easily fit this onto a B-size sheet. So I've got my border template here. So let's bring in another copy of this. I'm going to actually select this one and do a Control-C, and I'm going to do a Control-V on this. Okay, so now I've got this over here, and now I'm going to bring in my notes. So I'm going to change this one to a notes instead. So I can change any one of these that I drop into to a different layer. Okay. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move this title here because I'll clean it up in a minute, but sometimes it gets tough to grab it when they're on top of each other. So I'm going to do this, I'm going to bring it in. So what's interesting about bringing in mechanical layers here is that anything, or any layer for that matter, even if it exists outside of the board, it will bring it in. So this what I did is I brought in my notes here. This is my notes page, and I brought in my, the overlay for the template. And so just by overlaying them on top of each other, I now have my notes page. And this would work just fine. Again, if I've already got this information in my PCB doc, I may as well take advantage of it. And lastly, what I can do too is that if I really want to spiff this up a bit, instead of having just a blank board, I can certainly go here and place it one more time. So I'm going to place it from here just because it will give me a default top view, which is what I want anyway. So I'll go in here, I'll place this down here, I'll click on it just again to change its scaling to 0.95, and that should just drop straight on top of it. Let's move this layer here so we can do this. And by the way, I can turn off the titles as well. I think maybe it's 0.9. Let's try that. I forgot what I changed it to. There we go. So there it is. And I can change the titles. I can hide them. I can make, so for example here, if I don't need to have a top layer, I don't want it there, I can just click on the little eyeball and away it goes. So I've got that there and I'm good to go. Okay. So there's a different ways that you can add these things in. So I'm going to add another sheet in here. So let's go to Tools, Add Sheet. Okay. What else can we add into this? Well, just to show you a copy and paste, one that I think is really, really important. It's one that I don't see in notes all too often, but I really want to recommend it. It's the fabrication file. So there really should be a table that tells of all the different fabrication files that you have here. Okay, so I'm going to zoom you in here. Actually, I'm also going to change this. Before I do that, let me go back over here to a smaller one so we don't have such large zooming efforts here. So I'm going to click on here. I'm going to go into my page options. I'm going to click on standard, and I'm going to drop this down to A size. Actually, I'll just bring our template back in here. So let's do that, and we've got it. There's our A size, and I will click on this. And actually, I will not be able to. Let me do a Control X and then drop it down here. One of the things, and this is kind of important to recognize, this is a really great example. If I wanted to take this and bring this up to the top one, I can't. So this is one thing Altium is going to have to work on because they're not used to having multiple sheets in the same editor here. So if I wanted to bring this fabrication files text box, actually it's a table box, to the top over there, I would actually have to do a Control X, and then I do a Control V here, and then that would drop it in. Okay, so that's all I need to do with that one. Okay, so that's what we've got over here. But let me talk about the fabrication files for a moment, because I think this is really, really important. And I'm still perfecting, and I'll probably try to put together a blog on this to talk a little bit more about this idea. But what I think is really important for people to put in there is not only what do you expect from the fabrication file set that you're going to give to manufacturing, but also what are the formats and where are they located? if you put this on this master sheet over here, this is going to help people tremendously. Again, we're talking to people, we here at 9.connects are talking to people. We're trying to basically update and bring back to life a lot of projects that they've had from 20, 25 years ago, and they don't know where any of this stuff is. So having a list like this really, really would help on a master set of documentation. So that's another thing that you can certainly add to your fabrication notes. And again, I did this one out of simply adding this here to an Excel sheet and then copying it in. I just didn't want to go through the process here just due to time considerations. All right, what else? Other things that we can place in over here. What I'm also going to bring in is I'm going to bring in the the layer stack legend. So let's bring that one in. So we've got that over here. So the layer stack legend is all going to depend on how much information that you provided in the PCB tool under the layer stack manager here. So if there's things that are missing you don't like, you can always go back into that tool and fix it. You cannot fix it here. All you can do is kind of clean it up a little bit. Now this legend that comes in by default is showing you actual sizes or scaling it based off of sizes. So you can see that the core over here is far larger than the rest of it. If this is kind of an eyesore to you, there's another feature which I tend to like. So if you just want to see the layers, you can go into the properties where it says real width and heights. We can change this to align table rows, and boom, it's done. If you want all of this to look the same with the same colors, you've got basically three flavors for the usual layer font, signal layer font, and the dielectric fonts here. So if I want to have them all the same, I can do that. So I just want them all to be black. I want them all to be 12, and I don't want any italicized. So as you can see, as I'm going along over here, it is changing those things up for me. So there it is. And again, I can change things like the titles and so on and so forth. What you're going to find in here, with really the exception of the table property, which I've shown here now, anything that you have Altium just generate and throw down, other than maybe changing colors and styles, you're not going to have a lot of opportunity to change like individual information. So if you wanted to change this thing from 0.5 millimeters to something smaller, in terms of, like I really don't want 0.25 millimeters. I actually want 0.20. You're going to have to go back to its source and make the change for it. So just be aware. I think I missed one here. So let's make that 12. And there it is. So now it's all better lined up over there. So it's really a matter of just taking a look at what they provide for properties. And I'm pretty sure there's other things that they could add in there too. The one thing I didn't find, for example, is I didn't find necessarily a grid. So that was one thing that I think would be nice. But again, that's kind of what it is all about. It's either they've got it or they don't, and you take what you got there. One other feature I do like, though, is this thing called the units. They have primary units and dual units. So if, for example, you're one of those people like me who's still stuck in Imperial and using mils, and I want to see mils, but I've got to provide these things in millimeters, that's not a problem. I can turn this on over here, and they can put in parentheses. Now, if I want the mils to be first and the millimeters to be second, it's just a matter of swapping these lists over here, where I make this one mils and this one over here the millimeters, and I can swap them out accordingly there. There's also precision too, so obviously 0 millimeters is kind of fruitless here. So if you want to change that, you can. I think we can go to something a little smaller, and now you can see that precision. So they give you that feature as well. Okay, let's create another sheet. Let's go to Tools, and we'll add another sheet. And let's bring that here. So again, I'm going to go into the fabrication, and I'm going to drop one more for to just demonstrate our dimensioning. So if we go into the board fabrication view, again, here is my part, and here's my top. And again, can you get a whole lot of information off of just looking at this? To some degree, you can. However, we can also, it does provide information like, for example, dimensions, if we want to add those in. And Altium's dimensioning stuff is pretty good. So we're going to go over here to do a linear dimension on this. They do dimensions in two ways. Either you can pick a side or you can pick 2 points. So if I click on the side here, boom, I've got it. It's good to go. The caveat to this one is that once I've got this, I can move this over here. So I can move the information, and I can move this scaling back and forth. What I cannot move are the points in which it's placed down. And by the way, you're going to see this in a number of different features in the Draftsman tool. So if you don't like where you put this, you're like, oh shoot, I really wanted the measurement to be from this point to this point over here, then you would actually have to delete it. But I am going to leave this here, and I'll show you this feature again with the 2 points. So if I do a place linear dimension, you'll notice that there's a little orange dot. And because there's 3 sides over here, I need to use this one instead if I want to actually get it from the very top to the very bottom. So I'm going to use this first point and drop it down. I'm going to put down the second point, and then I'll put this out here, and now I can get that. And I can continue to do that. And they have other things that we can use as well. So for example, if we want to do like an angular dimension, I just have to click 2 sides here, and then I can pull it out, and voila, it's there. And they do, again, they give you some options here for aesthetic purposes as to which value or units you want to use over here, what color you want these, the font sizes, and so on and so forth. But so that's very, very usable. The last thing I'll show you here on the fabrication side, is the drill table. So let's bring this down over here. So let's go into. I'm still in the mode, so let's click on that. There we go. So let's go over here into the drill table. I'll place down. So any information you have on the drill table, it's instantly there. Again, this is things you can clean up, but there's very few things you can actually change on the drill table itself. If there's things that need to be changed, you've got to do it in the PCB editor, and that stuff can be updated. By the way, to update, it's simply a matter of just clicking on Tools, Update Board, and it will pull in the new information. So you don't have to delete it and replace it again. Let's go here into the Place menu. There's one other thing that's really useful here. And again, it's really more for these days it's more for aesthetics, but there is a value to this. If you got somebody who's looking for the fiducials, or they want to know about mounting holes, or they want to know about holes in the board. So putting down the actual drill drawing does have some merit to it. Okay, so there it is. So for example, I do actually have 4 mounting holes. They're represented by a letter X here. And if I don't like this and I want to actually use circles instead, I can actually change that up. And if I change it over here, it actually changes in the drill table as well. So if I go into the drill symbols here, by the way, I can't do it in the drill table. Interestingly enough, I do it in the drill drawing view table. So I'm going to click on drill symbols. I'm going to say I don't want a circle over here because it's a little bit misleading. I want something different. So I'm going to put this as a triangle. But for the X's over here, I do want a circle type thing. So I'm going to click on this circle here, and I'll press OK. And now I've actually got these I've got these things kind of better represented in terms of where my mounting holes are, in addition to it being a drill table. If I do want to put out some notes, for example, I can certainly do that as well. So if I go into Place, there's 2 things in our annotations that are of note. One is the actual note. So I'm going to put the note over here, okay, and I'll click down over here. They always default this, which is kind of good because they needed kind of to put something out there. Otherwise, you wouldn't even know where to begin with it. But what's nice about the notes is that the call-out annotations also can be linked to the notes as well. So I'm going to move this over here so you can see this. And I'm going to put an annotation over here to one of the mounting holes. So I'm going to go into Place, Annotations, Call-out. And Call-out here, I'll just click on this, and I'll put this here. And at first, it kind of looks a little bold, but we can change a few of these things here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this. And what's neat about these callouts is that you have a number of different items. Like this is clicking to, by default, a BOM item. I don't have the bill of materials here, but if I did, I can actually do a call out for a number in the bill of materials itself. I can do custom text if I want to. That's exactly what you saw in the non-electrical stuff. But I can also do an item number as well. And if I do an item number, it's going to say, well, okay, you said you want to refer to a note item. Tell me which item number. So I'll refer to note number 1. As for the squares and if I use a square or circle, I don't want that, I can change those things too. I can go into over here the border types, and I can change them. Some of this is driven by the note itself. So because this is a 1 and this is a 1, the note is actually driving what this representation is. So in the note itself, it depends on which number I want to look at. And in this case, I want to look at note number 1, which is down here in the properties. So I'll leave the border as a square, but I'll also say that this is a mounting hole. Try to spell that right. Mounting. My spelling is phenomenal today. There we go. Mounting hole. So when I do that and I click down, you can see that now the note is associated with this as well. So by having the callouts and the notes, you can do some really cool things with it, and you can put the squares and the circles. There's one other thing I'll note before we get on to the stuff in the assembly. There is things for datums, and I don't really want to get into that today. Some really great things about datums in the feature control frame over here, but I think this actually warrants pretty much a webinar all its own. It has to do with what they call GDT, which is geometric dimensioning and tolerances. It's kind of interesting because the CID folks have gotten into it more. If you're familiar with the CID training, they tend to get into it a lot more. And interestingly enough, it's more the mechanical engineers who get this type of training rather than the electrical folks. But nevertheless, I think it's there. So if you do need to put any of those type of datum type of features, they've got the whole list in here, and it's pretty useful. So that's what you've got over here for the fabrication side. Let's talk about some assembly notes now. What can we do with the assembly? So let's go over here and create a new file. So, and by the way, we can put everything in one file. However, one thing I found, and this is when I was experimenting and putting things down, the more pages that you put on and the more references it has to the PCB design, the slower it is going to be for that file to operate. So I really do recommend a separate fabrication and a separate assembly file, and it's not really that hard to do. So I'm going to go into File, New, and I'm going to jump into the Draftsman document again. And again, this time I still will use, I'll still use the default, and so I can drop those features down. You can take a look at them here, and I'll click on this and press OK. All right, so what do we have for our assembly? So one of the things they've got over here is a different view called the board assembly view. So the board assembly view is different from the fabrication one because the fabrication one's based off of the layers that you have created in the PCB dock. This is really more almost like based off of really more of the 3D stuff. And what's kind of nice about a lot of this is that just as long as you've got your 3D things going, it doesn't put a lot of emphasis or doesn't lean on the mechanical layers as much. And I know there are people who have really great mechanical layers, and again, you saw how you can bring those mechanical layers in. But if your mechanical layers are a little, let's say a little sloppy, and you still want to use this tool, as long as your 3D is looking good, you still can make a lot of use out of this tool over here. So there it is from the top view. But what's neat about this is that if I want to have it from several other views, I certainly can do that. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to copy the same thing here about 4 more times. You'll see why here in just a minute. Okay, so then we'll do this one down here and this one down here. I don't know if you noticed this too, but it's very similar to what PowerPoint provides. You can see that as you're bringing it in, they do show you some grid alignments, which is a really nice feature. So I don't know if you see those little lines. Of course, when I deselect it and drop it, those lines go away. And I don't know the granularity of the GoToMeeting if you can see it. But if you are trying to align it up, some of these grid lines come into place so you can see it. So what am I going to do with all these? Well, I'll click on this one here, and I can change the different views. So I can go put this one to the bottom. This one here, I can go over here and put this one to the left, this one to the right. I think you kind of see where I'm going with this here. So they can give you, basically different ways of representing this if you find this useful and necessary. Okay, some people say, nah, this is kind of nice, but I'll take real pictures of it. But they do provide it here. You may have also noticed in the menu here, I don't know how fast it's, again, because of the reframe right, there's also something that's called a true geometry. And I have to admit, I've looked into it, but I don't know a whole lot about what this is. But it looks as though it's showing through it as opposed to doing solid boxes. So when I bring in the true geometry over here, I'll just show you the differences between this one and this one, though I think this is from the left side. But nevertheless, once it brings it in, you can see it here. I'll drag it over so you can see this to the left. So it almost looks the exact same. It's just that almost though you're seeing basically the outlines rather than the fill itself. I have to admit, I'm not sure where they're going with that, and I didn't find a whole lot of documentation. But there's probably a rhyme or reason for it to be in there. So I just wanted to make you aware of it. Let's bring in another page, and let's do an add sheet. So another thing that we can bring in, okay, is we can bring in we can also bring in a bill of materials. Now this one is kind of always, I'm always on the border with this, and I think that if you have around 24 or less, it's always worthwhile to bring in a bill of materials. And you have a lot of control over it. So again, you can't necessarily change the information here. That has to be changed in the schematic and in schematic libraries. And we've done our fair share of videos on that. So if you're curious to know how to do that, go check out our webinar listings on it. But if you're interested in turning on certain columns, or you're interested in only certain things, because I think you can turn off certain elements of this, you can certainly do that. Because for some people, they do need to show some call outs. And you saw that earlier with the call out, that it can make a reference to the bill of materials if you already have it placed out here. So the bill of materials can be of definite value depending on what you're trying to make of it. So again, there's a lot of different things that you can do based off of the properties that they have here. And that's really kind of the key things I wanted to show with that over here. Excuse me, let's put this over here. What other goodies do we have? There's one other one that I think is really, really useful, especially if you are doing any type of placement work. Either you're doing it or you've got a lab that's doing this. It's really useful for sometimes to lay out things for individuals. And so I'm going to bring that up here. So let me go into Tools and add another sheet in there. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, again, bring in the board assembly view. So let's bring this in. But this time, I'm going to change its scale here to 2:1. So let's go over here and change the 2:1. So it's a much bigger scale, but I am going to leave it up here. You'll see why here in just a moment. And what's really neat about this is that you can see that it also has all of these references. All the designators are there, and a kind of an outline of your 3Ds here as well. So it's done a lot of work for you. But if you don't want these things in the center, you can't read them. Like this is really difficult. R1's really hard to read here. I can actually click on it, and I can actually get it out of the center. So if I want to push it to the left here, I can do that. I can't. I tried doing manual, but it doesn't allow me to do it yet. I know that they've got a feature for it, but at some point, hopefully they'll allow you to do manual. But right now, I'm forced to kind of pick either left, right, or whatever they've got over here in the middle, and that's fine. So if I go over here to the bottom here, you can see it. And again, keep in mind it's based off of the rotation and orientation of the part itself. So even though I call it bottom, it kind of looks like it's really been pushed to the right. So they do give you those features. You just got to go through each one of them and make those changes. Now, what about these really tiny ones? Because obviously, if you're working on a board and they've got a lot of stuff on here and you want to magnify that and show a little more detail, you can certainly do that. So another tool that they've got is under Place, Additional Views, Board Detail View. So like the other things, once you place the initial point over here, you can make this circle, this magnifying circle, bigger or smaller, but you can't move the overall circle, so be careful where you initially start it here. So I'm going to place it here, and then once I'm done, it will instantly give me a circle. It's always a 4:1, and that's fine. I can change that, okay? So once I've got this over here, I now also have a label that I can make use of, but in addition to that, I can also change this here. So when I click, let's see if I can click on that. There we go. So when I click on this, I can also shrink down this particular magnifying glass. The one thing I want to forewarn you about is that I can't necessarily grab this magnifying glass and force this one to get bigger or smaller. So it doesn't go both ways. This this circle here, the main circle that I initially drew is the one that's going to call the shot. So just be very, very aware of that here. Okay. So those are some of the features. The very last one I'll show you here, and again, there's a few others, but I know I'm getting kind of pressed for time. So I'm going to go into Place here. The other one that might be of any value, again, it's really more for aesthetics than anything else, is the board isometric view. So if I want to put this down, I certainly can. So there it is. It's kind of a nice thing to have on there for again, visual representation more than anything else. There is one last one I think is really important. I will show it to you. If you have a component and that component needs some additional notes to it, or you really want to spell it out, you can actually put down individual component views too. So if I go into Place and I go into my additional views and I do my component view and I place this down. Now, right now it looks like it's just nothing more than a big sentence, but if I zoom it in, you can see over here it's the side view of the C1 capacitor, because that's the first in the list. But let's say I want to actually show my battery holder here, which is P1. So I'm going to get that in here. And so now it's showing me P1. And so again, I can do very similar to what I did with the board views. I can click over here and say, well, okay, that one's can be the side view. This one I want over here to be the top view. And there it is over there, and I can move it down. And of course, if I want to put the notes down, I can do the Place Notes, I can do the call outs, and I can add that information in there as well. So a lot of really neat features that they have provided here. The last thing I'm going to show you before we kind of go over to Q&A and a couple of other announcements and another polling question, I'm going to go over here to the Arduino Mega. So this was the daughter board, well, actually the rangefinder is the daughter board to the Arduino here. So I have this Arduino up and going here, and what I wanted to do is just kind of show you what happens if I use a template. So I don't have any Draftsman set up on this right now. I'm going to go into File, New, and I'm going to go into Draftsman Document. And again, we got our templates here, but this time I'm going to tell it to use the fabrication notes that I've already set up. And I'm going to press OK. Now this is going to take a few moments because again, it's pulling in, it's got to pull in everything, right? So it's pulling in my notes. So these notes that I had the last time, because that's a part of the template, got pulled in again, and I can make a change to those. The drill table has come in. You may have noticed there's a lot more hits than in the prior one as well. Now, also notice that when I created my template, what you're seeing over here is the original color before I changed it, because during the demonstration, obviously I changed it, but I didn't change it when I brought it in initially here. So it is bringing in a lot of data. It's bringing in the footprint data. It's bringing in the layer information, and you'll see why here in a moment, because there are more pages than one to this, and we'll take a look here in just a moment when it is done. Okay. What you're also going to see in the meantime is you will see the drill drawing, and you'll also see the layer stack manager that I brought in. And the other reason I brought this in, or wanted to show this to you, is because there's probably going to be a question about the vias. And what Draftsman will do is that if you have vias, it will show it to you on the layer stack. Because the rangefinder itself was only a 2-layer board, it didn't have any vias, so it didn't bother showing anything. What I did is I took the Mega, which is also a 2-layer board, and I added a bunch of different vias like blind and buried. It's not manufacturable the way I did it, but it at least gives you an idea of what the situation is with the vias here. So there you go. So you can see the different types of vias I created. Again, not manufacturable, but at least for your references there. So that's what I've got on this in the time that I've got left. I would like to bring up another polling question here now that you've seen this. Just like to see what your thoughts are about using it, or if you're going to continue to investigate tools of this nature. So take a look at the poll. All right, so there's the poll over there for you. So almost 2/3 of you are definitely going to take a look in it. That's good. So hopefully I was able to give you some good information about this. And it's good to see that a quarter of you are already using it. And for those who are probably not using it, that probably means you already have something better, and that's great, because I know that if you've got something like this already set up, that's probably makes your life a whole lot easier. So good stuff. What I'd like to do here is talk to you a little bit more about 9.connects, and in particular, I'd like to just mention something about Blueprint for those people who are not using Altium Designer. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to write them in, and I think I'll have a little bit of time to take a look at them here. So let me bring up my PowerPoint slide here. So obviously, you're here for a reason, and the reason you are here is because, let's face it, documentation is not the fun stuff. I was kind of thinking about this the other day, that if there was ever fringe benefits to being an electrical engineer, I didn't have to take a foreign language class, and I didn't have to write term papers for my electrical engineering classes. Okay, so when it comes to documentation, a lot of us avoid it because it's a hassle, and we don't care to do it. The fun stuff is in the actual schematics. The fun stuff is actually in the layout itself. That's the engineering challenge. But there has to be an easier way. There has to be a more efficient way. Hopefully, I've shown you that there are different methods for this here. I wanted to bring up Blueprint by Downstream Technologies because we do represent it here at 9.connects. But more importantly, what you saw over here is very much similar to Blueprint because Altium effectively copied the concept. They didn't rip it off. They didn't do anything illegal. They just said, hey, we really like what you did in Blueprint over here. Let's provide this in our tool for our customers. So if you liked what you saw, Blueprint is the same thing. Blueprint does work across all EDA tools, so it's all based on the manufacturing files, not their source files. So if you have Gerber's ODB++, IPC, the NC drill files, all that stuff can get pulled into Blueprint, and they can effectively do what you saw here today. So why would you be interested in this? Well, first and foremost, I really do like Altium Draftsman. They've done a good job with it, but you can see it's still a work in progress. There's what I'll call rough edges that they still need to smooth out on it. And I think there's also a few other features that they could probably add in. That's going to happen over time, but if you need something now, well, there it is. There's Blueprint that's already spent decades doing this type of thing. Same document across different EDA tools. So there's a company here in San Diego. I can't mention them because they're not our customer yet, but nevertheless, they actually have a system in which when they purchase other companies to do print circuit boards, when they buy them, they do not force everybody to be on the same platforms as they are using at the main corporation. So if you're using a different tool, that's fine. If you're using different libraries, that's fine. If you even have different manufacturing processes, that's fine. At the end of the day, though, your documentation will look the exact same. And so what they do is they say, hey, as long as you've got Blueprint and you've got the company template, do what you need to do. But at the end of the day, you've got to take what you've got and put it into our Blueprint templates, and that's how they keep uniform documentation. And there's a ton more features in Blueprint. I mean, anytime you look at any one of those features there, you can do an hour's presentation on all the features, because since they do represent a lot of major companies, when they call up and say, we need this, they are very quick to add it in there. So you're talking about 20 years worth of additions and improvements that make it very, very powerful. So that's, if you are interested in that, let me jump out here for a moment and bring up our website so you can take a look at it here. If you are interested in it, here we go. Here's 9.connects.com. If you go under products and you go to DST manufacturing documentation, you can take a look at what we've got here. I did a very, very quick video some time ago here just to show how fast and easy it is. Again, you can kind of see why it's so fast and easy. And if you need a little more detail here, we had done like more of a 20-minute dissertation on the product itself. Our hour is up at this point in time. I want to thank you so much for joining us here today. And hopefully you'll join us for our next webinar. So again, I want to thank you, and we'll catch you next month.